Thank you, sir. Really appreciate you joining us for this discussion, and welcome to today's episode where we have the privilege of speaking to Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, profound economist of our time. He has been an insider to the top economic policy making of this country for almost 3 decades, and that spans over at least more than half a dozen prime ministers. That's not to exaggerate. If I remember correct, so you after finishing your initial stint in the World Bank in the late 70s, I mean early 80s, till 91, when this watershed moment that 91 moment that happened, we all take pride in. And for a moment, if someone assumes that 1969, the Mrs. Gandhi's bank nationalization event, for a moment, if that is kept aside, probably this is the single most economic reform that the world is going to remember when it comes to the India's economic story for time to come. And I personally, whatever little interaction that I heard with you in the past, you are not in favor of the idea of self-appropriating the credit. Just to give an anecdote, I remember Sri Lanka's former president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, once was talking to one of the Indian channels, and obviously he quoted you. And I think it is in just before Dr. Singh passing off, or I'm just forgetting the context. And one of the first names that he took is yours. And then I had a very inherent temptation to just let you know that this is what I just heard. And then you said, no, it was Mr. Rao and Dr. Singh. I was only assisting him. The point that is the stark feature of any profound, accomplished, distinguished person. Instead of appropriating, assuming the credit to themselves, they rather believe in diverting or just share with others, and that's exactly you have been doing. And it is in this context we will also. It's important that we refer to your book. That I think one of the best things that could have happened to me during COVID is, well, there are a lot of unpleasant things even at the personal sphere that we all experienced. While writing my own book, I also got a chance to read through your this thing, and one of the initial statement that you have made in the book, saying that you are not in favor of writing a memoir for the simple reason that you feel that it is more of a selfie that is in a book form. And you have also told about the journey, India's experience with economic reform, that the first generation reform that we all refer to. And there are host of economists, bureaucrats, civil servants, even the political figures that you acknowledged by giving credit to them. And in the paucity of time, I don't think that is neither that the mandate for us to remember and giving tribute to them, but that all shows collectively that that's such a defining moment that were engineered at a time where India was the whole. I think same. Just going back to Ranil Wickremesinghe, he said, and he had no qualms in saying that. He said, when it was all happening to India, we were scared because we all look up to India. But at the same time, it's very confident that Dr. Singh, Montek saying they are in the, they are part of Mr. Rao's cabinet, so they'll do something so that we all will sail through. The book that I was referring to, your book that titled Backstage: The Story Behind India's High Growth Years, you provide a first-hand account of India's economic transformation. Till 91, just to give a context, we sort of we embraced a template that was more driven by the principles of command economy, and which many loosely call it a Soviet model. And in your book and even otherwise, it is very candidly articulated that it is not that the people in this country, in different spheres, they were not knowing that there was some problem, there's something not working out. However, for some reason, either they were waiting for a inflection point, or there was not trigger enough, or largely with the lack of political willingness, the thing which stopped delivering the system that was not operating at a speed or with an efficiency with which it should, the time is to adopt something new. And when I say this, in 2007, the World Bank, former US Fed Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan says, and refer to Dr. Singh, saying that what he referred to Indians' Fabian socialism, he said India, which had a regimental economic model, Dr. Singh with his team, he made a modest hold to that. And that's how he said even the little economic state that will have a huge economic leverage. And that today we all take credit in right from the manufacturing of cars, shoes, burgers, or even the stock market for that matter, that all we almost take for granted. That was all direct offspring of the initiatives that took. And you being one of the three architects, I know in the book, you refer to Prime Minister Rao, Dr. Singh, and of course, the Commerce Minister, Mr. Chidambaram. But the whole world, when it reflects on that moment, I think you become an important pillar. And so in that sense, you become one of the three major architects that brought that thing. So now it is in this question, sir, if we go, enter to our core conversation. Sir, you prepared a document, which is a very comprehensive document and which is popularly called AIM document. And that covered all spectrums, all aspects of the reforms that we all intended to carry out at that point in time. And luckily that document in its substance found its way to the industrial policy of 91 that undid a template that was manifested with proliferation of licenses, monopolies, or even excessive government control. So what we call LPG reforms. So now with you are an Oxford trained economist, you had a very long stint at the multilateral international financial institutions, and then you had the distinction of working with the top leadership of this country at a very senior bureaucrat level. So therefore, how you wrote that's not the question. Instead, what would be more fascinating to know, sir, what was the source of confidence that the leadership would be able to onboard the stakeholders and move them along, because we are a democracy and things are not very simple to move, and these are not very incremental changes that we are doing. These are you are experimenting something which was never done in Indian context. So it would be nice to know that how that document, when we were preparing, there must be something in mind. It was not just another research paper that you would have written. So where that confidence was coming that you will take people who are not necessarily politically aligned and even otherwise, and finally that you were successful.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to your podcast. And let me thank you also for saying a few nice things about my book, Backstage. I really think that when I wrote it, I wanted to put across for subsequent generations the story of how these things changed and really demonstrate how unbelievably bad the control regime was. And I think anyone who reads my book will get a lot of sense that, many people, it's not just me, many people, both inside and outside, were complaining about the control regime. And I think the 1991 moment was a moment when we had a short-term crisis, balance of payments crisis. And I think credit must be given to Prime Minister Rao for recognizing that this crisis cannot be solved by the usual traditional approaches. The traditional approach, if you have a balance of payments crisis, would be to impose a restriction on imports. That if you have inflation, would be to try to control prices by imposing price controls. He realized that this is not going to work. And we have a much more basic change to make, that he, as the prime minister who had been brought in, he knew that basic changes were needed. Now, changes I mean, to structure all the changes that are needed in an internally consistent way, which where different actions support each other, requires a lot of technical skill. And that is really the architecture of the reforms. What is essential? What is not essential right now? What do you have to do in order to make other things work, etc.? And I think he chose Dr. Manmohan Singh as the finance minister as someone who would understand these things. Now, a lot of people say that, look, obviously, you had a major crisis, foreign exchange had run out, you had to do something. You just listened to the World Bank and the IMF, and they dictated what you had to do. This is complete rubbish, in my view. Because I think inside, I mean, of course, it's true that there was a crisis and we had to do a short term stabilization. It's also true that a short term stabilization always means that if you have a current account deficit that has become very large because of buildup of excess demand domestically, which is also reflected in rising prices, then you need to reduce internal demand. And the way to reduce internal demand is to bring about a fiscal contraction. So that was a no brainer. And I think when you have that situation, you also want to encourage exports and discourage imports through price means. And for that, you need a devaluation. So you have to do something on the exchange rate. But I think we also realized that over the years, the control economy that we had developed was actually an outdated mechanism of control. People had said earlier that we must change our systems of control, but they never actually got to doing it. And I think, I mean, you mentioned the M document. I had worked on this in 1990 because when VP Singh went to Malaysia, I was part of the delegation. And he said to me that, look, I came to Kuala Lumpur in 1973 as Deputy Minister for Commerce, and the thing has changed completely in 1990. And I said, yes, I used to come here too for the World Bank in 1973, and it's transformed. So he said, why has that happened? And I said, because they're doing reforms and we are not. So he said to me, you write me a paper on what we need to do. And I wrote that paper. He didn't tell me whether he agreed with the paper or not, but he did send it to the cabinet secretary and saying, please have this discussed in the committee of secretaries. And then that paper leaked in the press. Of course, it didn't have the name of anybody, and most people they knew it came from the PMO. And since I was the special secretary, they assumed that I had written it, which was true. I never actually confirmed that, but one of the well-known journalists of the time, Ashok Desai, said it's well known that this has been written by Montek, but he's not confirming it. So let's just call it the M document. Um, and I found it interesting that when it was discussed, not everybody in the government agreed, but quite a lot of people had the same view. So it's not that this view was not supported by others, but there were people with different views. And I think that when Narasimha Rao ji became prime minister and he brought in Dr. Manmohan Singh had read this paper. He said later on that he had seen it earlier. And he himself had given a very nice convocation address in the Institute of Management in Bangalore, where he had, before he became finance minister, saying, you look, we need to make big changes. What we are doing is not right. And anyway, when he became finance minister, he had to stabilize the economy and control the crisis. But he adopted the approach never waste a crisis. It's not enough just to stabilize the economy. Use this opportunity to do the structural reforms that will make the economy grow in a sustainable and inclusive basis over a long period of time. Because we had been falling behind. I mean, that was very clear. The Southeast Asian economies were barging ahead. We were not. And so he outlined a program of reforms. And that is how the program got implemented. And, how to pull things together is a difficult task. I mean, he did it in many different ways. it was immediately attacked by the left as a sellout to market forces. He managed to get 4 or 5 very distinguished economists who had worked in government earlier, people like I.G. Patel, P.N. Dar, Ram Malhotra, M. Narasimham, to write a short paper saying this is the right thing to do. So, there was a debate, a discussion, a mobilization of people who would be in favor of it. The left was not persuaded, but people could see that there are a lot of other people who think it's a good idea. Internally, and I remember this, and I've mentioned this in my book, Backstage, he called all the secretaries together as finance minister. And he said, look, we're going to make big changes, and those changes are necessary. You are all in charge of different departments. We need your help. Without your conscious help, without each person wanting to help, if you just try to obstruct everything, we just won't be able to succeed. And I think most secretaries appreciated the fact that their advice was being sought. And he also said that, look, I can understand that some of you may have principled disagreements with this approach. So if you do that, please let me know, and I promise you, I'll get you a equally good job somewhere else, and you won't have to do something that you don't approve of. And it's interesting that the finance secretary at the time was S.P. Shukla. He had been commerce secretary. I replaced him as commerce secretary, and he was of a different mindset. Shukla actually went to the prime minister and said, "Look, I don't approve of what you're doing." So, finance minister said, "Okay, I promised you another job. I'll make you director of India for the ADB, which is a very high paid job and is generally regarded as a prime posting and so on." Shukla had several months to go before his own Singh, because he said, "Look, I don't approve of what you're doing, and I don't want to be bought off with some nice posting. I'm just going to retire prematurely and criticize you from outside," which is fine. And actually, that's how I came into the finance ministry, because a vacancy was created. I was commerce secretary, and I moved in. So I was in charge of the commerce ministry at the civil service level, bringing in the first range of trade reforms, exim scripts, and all that kind of stuff, and then moved to the finance ministry. So it was a very fascinating period, where there was a very conscious effort made by the government to make people realize that we are out of line. Now, I want to emphasize one thing, which is very important. Every policy reform has to be judged by the context. And the context in 1991 is very different from the context now. I mean, that was a time in which the whole world was totally in favor of liberalization and globalization. And it was shortly before that, Francis Fukuyama had produced his The End of History, that market economics has won. It was clearly an exaggerated view. And there were problems with globalization. We know that. But that's like many of the fellows who were totally pro market were excessively pro market. But we were not in that danger. We were at the other end of the spectrum. So, quite frankly, I had no doubt that excess market dependence would not be a bad thing, but it would not be a good thing. But it was going to take very long for us to get there. So we were so far in the control area, oriented area, that we should get rid of as many of these controls as we can. And my book brings out very sharply some of the absurdities in the control regime. And I detail them in the hope that younger people, because really they are the ones who have a vested interest in them, younger people should realize that when you start doing too much control, this is what happens, and they should make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. I think it's a great start. And very quickly, just to respond to your such a comprehensive briefing, that I mean, it reminds me how once left attacked Dr. Singh that we were preparing a budgetary policy that's on the World Bank dictate, and thanks to his sagacity, even in the strongest of criticism, he has that with a dose of humor. He could deal with that with a either to quote Victor Hugo, or even the Ode to the West Wind by Percy Shelley. That he said, yes, this we are working on to the WB dictate, and he further elaborates that it is West Bengal's interest. One of the important thing is, and obviously, I mean, time won't permit us to do, though we would like to. Even Dr. Singh held on to a view till end, while protecting the consumer interest remained a mainstay of the whole reform that was taking, because consumers were exploited earlier. But at the same time, he maintained the view that the mindless and heartless conspicuous consumerism must end, because
Yes, yes.
yeah, and that's quite resonating even today. And very nicely you contextualized. There's a context to it, any reform. So therefore, in the hindsight, it might be convenient to sit on it and dissect and find out, analyze it, and find uh, the things which could have been done differently, or whether that was appropriate. Man, that all can done. These all are post facto thing, but I think uh, very rightly you have this thing, and we all are aware of that. The aggravating factor was the Gulf War, where and that was pushing up not just the oil price, even the other commodity prices. And for the interest of the viewers, the World Bank and IMF, both the institutions, they operate with two very contrasting objectives. The World Bank is development oriented, the long-term projects, whereas the IMF, like Mr. Ahluwalia explained, that it takes care of through the short-term facility, the crisis like BOP crisis that the Sri Lanka recently went through, or even Bangladesh, Pakistan, they continue to experience. And that is something which the team that includes Dr. Rao, I mean, Narasimha Rao, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and Mr. Ahluwalia, who saved this country in that sense uh, by adopting a particular template. And that was a sort of reversal to the policies that we all were following all this, because that rather extreme view, but there is a view that the policies that we adopted before, it will be extremely ungrateful to say that there was not a diversified industrial class that we had. But the fact remains that we created, I mean, those policies created more poverty than wealth. Probably that was time, like you said, we had to go with uh, the rest of world, that when world was moving. And then just to, before I go to the next question, I think when you landed in India, the early 80s, you already had the experience of witnessing
No,
how other
not
countries are
not the early
manufacturing.
80s. I came back in 1979.
79, sorry, I'm so sorry, sir. And by then you already, because of your very the very demanding job in the World Bank, you were one of the, I think you were the distinction of becoming the director of their development vertical. So one can imagine what is the level of professional excellence that requires. And you, so the point I'm making, by the time you came to join the government here as the economic advisor, you already had the experience of seeing how other countries are managing their crisis and how they're developing. So probably that would have been a sort of
No, I think that
yeah.
it's an important point that we used to bring in people with expertise from outside. Now,
Mhm.
let me say, I wasn't the only fellow coming in. I mean, if I look at that period, just before me, Bimal Jalan
Yes.
came in from the IMF World Bank.
Mhm.
Vijay Kelkar came in from outside as economic advisor.
Mhm.
Rakesh Mohan, who was economic advisor industry when the reforms took place, had been brought in. Shankar Acharya, shortly after me, joined the finance ministry.
SS
Arvind
Tarapu.
Virmani, Arvind Virmani, who's now a member of Niti Aayog,
Yeah.
he came in. So, there was a range of people
NK
who
Singh.
actually had been brought in. I was not the only one.
Yeah.
So I think the atmosphere was one, at least within the bureaucracy,
Mhm.
that people would talk freely and were open minded. Now, not every bureaucrat was inclined to the new ideas, but you don't have to have that. I mean,
Mhm.
you need a discussion and let different points of view prevail. So it was an environment where even the senior bureaucrats, the pure IAS officers, they
Mhm.
had different views. I mean, some of them were pro liberalization and others had doubts.
Mhm. Absolutely. But one unique thing about you continued as the finance secretary even under the United Front government, and even if I remember correct, even the first few months of Vajpayee took over the India one, you continue till you moved to
Yeah,
planning commission as a
I was
member.
there
Yeah.
throughout. I was there throughout the Narsimha Rao Manmohan Singh period.
Mm-hmm.
They were then replaced by the United Front government, which had
Devegowda.
Devegowda and Inder Gujral for
Yeah.
about 3 years. So I continued. Then Vajpayee ji became prime minister, and I
Yes.
continued there for 6 months.
Mm.
So it's probably true that one reason for that, quite honestly, is that having come in laterally and got promoted, I mean, I became secretary at a relatively younger age. And unless you make people secretary at a relatively younger age, they sort of retire within 3 or 4 years.
True.
And I think we need to think about if you want. I mean, I remember when I was finance secretary, I spoke to the cabinet secretary and I said, look, we're looking at our top appointments for the financial sector. And let's be clear about it. For a top government public sector financial company, you shouldn't have anybody appointed who's not going to be there for
Mhm.
3 years at least. So he said, yeah, I agree with you. So I said, okay, the Life Insurance Corporation chairmanship is coming vacant. If we accept the proposition that nobody can be appointed if they don't have 3 years, you have to bypass the first 12 names on the list. And he said, no, we can't do that. Now, in my view, we should be able to promote people to higher salaries, but separately promote people to jobs. I mean, when I was in the World Bank, I was running a division. So I was division chief. But each position has a range for salary and they overlap. So some of the senior people in the division were earning more money than I was earning. So when you're superseded for a job, it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you lose out on salary. And beyond a point, you could even ensure that every civil servant
Mhm.
beyond a certain level, when he retires, has the same salary that a secretary would have. So that his pension is the same as a secretary's. The amount of money that this costs is minute because the number of people is so small.
Mhm.
But it will avoid this problem that people say, no, I'm senior, therefore I must be appointed. That's not the way to run a modern government, in my view. But
Absolutely.
I don't. I mean, we were not able to change that. I don't think the present government has been able to change that either.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's enough thinking on this.
Mhm.
I mean, this can only be changed if there's a proper public debate on the role of merit versus seniority.
True. True. No, no.
I
One
mean,
thing I
we
think
have a
yeah.
lot to do in economic reforms. Let me
Mhm.
say the 91 reforms was just a start. I mean, after all, even today, in the richest countries in the world, people are doing reforms. So the need for reforms doesn't stop at one big reform. Each reform pushes the country to a different level, if you like, of development or growth trajectory. And soon enough, a new set of challenges emerges, and you have to address those. So the need for fresh thinking, which was very clear in 91, that is there, will be there, is there now, will be there 10 years later. But you don't do the same thing because the world has changed. What was good policy in 1991 may not be the best policy today because the world has changed.
True.
So I think you need a very active debate which involves both insiders and outsiders. And I think, frankly, our political class has to be much more open to debating these issues with the professional class in the country. That means businessmen, accountants, economists, the press, whatever, academics. We don't have that, and we should.
No, no, very, very important point, profound point, and at this government, I'm sure you give credit. They have sort of formalized the lateral entry. I mean, while it was all done previously, and you are one of the shining example. So who has not, I mean, when you
No, but
might
you know,
say,
what we've done, let me say, what we've done
Mhm,
in terms of lateral entry
mhm,
is only at the middle level,
yeah,
but it's for a fixed term.
okay,
So basically, they come in and they go out.
okay,
So, I mean, most of these people that I'm talking about,
yeah,
Bimal Jalan and Vijay Kelkar and Shankaracharya and I and several others, I won't mention names, they
mhm,
came in and then they stayed. Of course, they can always go out if they want to, and some of them left. Government to bring someone in for 3 years at a middle level, it does a lot of good to them. And when
okay,
they go back to their companies, they're very valuable. But
okay,
it doesn't give them enough time to work within the government for change.
okay,
So you need deeper thinking than that.
right, okay. Not fair point. So we move on to the next issue that we wanted to pick up. Trump being Trump, and US is a state which no one can take lightly, no matter who is in the White House. Uh, the geopolitical scenario are tensed, not because there are ongoing armed conflicts in different parts, even otherwise the new uh, sort of the new menace that is the tariff war. Uh, so there, what we see, there's a rising protectionism and more inward looking, which again many might prefer to call it as if it's a deglobalization, which is not correct. That's a more of a emotional outburst. Just to set a context, how it is relevant to us, because these all are linked, because in WTO 1995, uh, was it not the fact that even all the countries, including the developed country like US, they accepted the position that the emerging countries like India will have the choice to choose the tariff. So now they say everything is fair in love and war, and then trade is done ruthlessly just to protect own interest. So what happened to that legacy, those historical, ethical aspects that all became the building block, the foundational pillars for the commitment for an arrangement which is mutually beneficial world at large. So what's your view, sir? How do
Well, yeah, this is
like in a
that's a very,
power dynamics, how does it place out? Yeah.
it's a very complex situation. So let me explain my position. Okay, first of all, let me say that I think that the situation is still evolving. Okay, but I would make 2 points. Number one, the trend of retreat from a kind of total commitment to free flows and globalization and trade and all the rest of it didn't start with Trump. This has actually been going on. If you go back to 1998, when the Seattle WTO meeting took place, there were lots of demonstrations. The perception was that in the United States, some of the traditional industries were being hollowed out. Okay. Now, there's nothing wrong with being hollowed out if you're not a competitive producer. I mean, every economy has to restructure to move towards what is its competitive advantage. And knowledgeable people in the US themselves said that the US's comparative advantage is in high tech stuff, not low tech manufacturing. So it's perfectly right for low tech manufacturing to move out. But I think what they didn't do is they didn't have a policy how to deal with the Midwest and places, what they call the Rust Belt, where basically a lot of traditional economic activity just died out. And they didn't have a way of upskilling that labor force and getting it to do different things. So it's a failure of domestic adjustment policy in the United States. But it was ignored because the US was doing very well. And in particular, the financial sector was doing incredibly well. Okay. So that was the period of the boom in the financial sector. And the US was much more concerned in getting rid of restrictions on capital flows abroad because they saw themselves as being the most competitive in controlling the financial system. A lot of thoughtful economists in the US said that the financialization of the US is not a good idea. And as a matter of fact, the share of financial sector profits in total corporate profits had shot up. Our own Raghuram Rajan, for example, had warned that what was being described as all sorts of financial innovations, were actually increasing the degree of risk. But I think it was Larry Summers who described him as a Luddite. So, and later on, of course, Raghuram proved right because you had the Lehman Brothers crisis, and many of the financial innovations that were supposed to reduce risk actually were seen to be amplifying risks. So there was, I think, on the US side, I would say mismanagement. Okay, well, that happens. As a result of the Lehman Brothers crisis, there was a huge upswelling of protests, unions particularly, take over Wall Street movement. And this happened in 2008, long before Trump. So, the reaction to globalization having some negative effects was there. Let me say, by the way, that globalization helped the developing countries because if the US was getting rid of manufacturing was moving to the developing countries. I mean, we benefited from it. Of course, the problem is that China benefited from it much more than anyone else. I really think that if other developing countries, including India, had been more willing to take advantage of globalization, what would have happened is that there would have been less asymmetry between China and the rest. And China would not have done as well as it did, and we would have done better. This would also mean that the US would not feel threatened by China. It would just have many more countries to deal with. When the Chinese basically did extremely well, and I don't blame them, rising power always questions an existing hegemonic power. And China changed its own strategy. Under Deng Xiaoping, the strategy was keep quiet, develop your strengths, don't shout about it too much. Under Xi Jinping, they had become a lot stronger. The strategy changed, and the Chinese quite explicitly challenged the United States, saying, we challenge you militarily, we challenge you technologically, and we also challenge you in terms of whether your system, i.e., democracy and liberal values, is best. In fact, our system is best because we are doing much better than anyone else. So the US then began to react. And this is before Trump. I mean, this had happened even during Obama's time, the concern that China was becoming a threat. Of course, in Trump 1, it became very clear. And in Biden's time, it was also very clear. And the United States started discriminating against China by limiting flow of technology, by sort of preventing the Chinese from getting access to the US market in sensitive electronics areas and so on. At that time, the thinking was not a wholesale retreat from globalization, but a kind of what I think Jake Sullivan, who's their national security advisor, had called a high fence but a small yard. So we'll fence off a small area which China won't be able to get into, but otherwise trade will remain rather free. That is what has changed quite a bit. And I think under Trump, you have altogether new theories being propounded, like reciprocal tariffs, which is nothing to do, which is actually, in my view, not workable. Okay. So there is no doubt that President Trump has added some very new and very questionable objectives, but the turn away from the older commitment of globalization predates Trump. And now we have a high degree of uncertainty. I mean, the original idea was that, look, China is threatening us and we must take action. But nobody can say that Canada is threatening the US. Nobody can say Europe is threatening nobody can say India is threatening the Europe. But tariffs are being raised on all these countries. And I am not in a position to judge how US policy will move. But quite frankly, if you were to ask me, I think it's very uncertain. Trump, of course, prides himself, from what I've read. I mean, I don't I have not studied this carefully, so I should say that, give a caution. This is my impression. Prides himself on being a highly transactional person. Now, one of the essences of a transactional person is you don't value rules. I mean, if you're transactional, you take every transactional transaction to see what you can gain from it. Okay. Uh, that is really being a bit of a bully. And a lot of people have described President Trump's actions as bullying actions. What will this do? I think this is a real issue which people are only now beginning to think about. Two questions arise. I don't think anybody can doubt that any leader wants to do the best for his own country. I mean, you don't get elected president of the United States, or for that matter, prime minister of India, in order to do good to the world. You're supposed to do the best you can for your country, and there's no difference between MAGA and MEGA or whatever. Make India great, make America great. Europeans want to make Europe great. UK wants to make UK great, etc. I think it's perfectly understandable that any leader wants to do the best for his country.
Yeah.
President Trump says he's doing this all for America.
Mhm.
I'm sure that our government is doing whatever it can for India.
Yeah.
The real question is this: do you believe that the best way of promoting your interest is to establish a set of multilaterally agreed rules
Mhm.
which introduce an element of certainty? Okay. And I think if you're totally transactional, then you don't believe in these rules. You just think that on every individual action, you're completely free to do whatever you like. And I don't know if the United States intends to pursue this. I mean, look, for example, the US has entered into a free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. Okay. They have a problem. They think that Mexico is not doing enough about the flow of drugs. They also feel that the Canadians are allowing a lot of immigrants to cross over. Now, if that's a problem, then you discuss with them how to stop that. But what President Trump is doing is to punish you for that behavior. I'm going to raise tariffs. But if we're going to raise tariffs, then you're negating the free trade agreement that you entered into with them. So this creates uncertainty. This means that what you agreed, you may depart from if you think is useful. So I think the whole issue of whether you believe that there is merit in moving to a set of multilaterally agreed rules which will constrain everybody's actions. This is what is at stake right now. And I like to think that we're just beginning to see the action. There will be a reaction. Some countries have already retaliated. And hopefully, the United States will also realize that a completely unconstrained transaction based relationship is not good for the world and is not good for America either.
Either.
But I mean, who am I to pronounce on the world? We have to wait and see. I think we have to recognize that the full extent of what President Trump thinks he can do is only just becoming with them and want to discuss. And I'm glad that our government has engaged in a discussion. He's said India is a tariff king, which is, by the way, our tariffs are too high. So I've been consistently of the view that it is in India's interests to lower the tariffs. That's a potentially controversial subject, but I'm not the only one. There are a lot of people, including some who are in government, who think that's a good idea. The critical thing I would say is the US is our largest trading partner. And the US is much more important to us than we are to them. So I'm afraid they are not being as sensitive as they should be to our concerns, which probably reflects the fact that they're much larger. We have to be sensitive to their concerns. I just hope that the bilateral discussions that are going on, I mean, you read in the new, I don't know what's happening, but you read in the newspapers that our commerce minister is going there and everybody thinks that we are reaching some sort of an agreement. I think that'd be a good thing. And if that happens, I think that will establish that, yes, discussion works. But at the same time, you need certainty. I mean, we reach an agreement, then on something else, they shouldn't suddenly tear up the agreement because some other thing has become a problem. And this is really in a global world, uh, people will not invest in what are otherwise good investment opportunities if they don't have a sense of certainty. That's why we say ourselves, we should make our policies more certain and eliminate uncertainty. They should do the same.
True, true. Absolutely. Thank you. I think you made an important point, and before I move it to my next issue, in somewhere in your book also you have referred to we can grow with stealth. Quietly we can grow, and that's exactly you also part of the thing that one has to do everything to grow. You don't have to make a big fuss about it, but you can keep growing. So India remains a bright spot, and our particularly our post-COVID recovery. I know uh, you're part of. You still continue to be part of the high-level advisory board. That's an initiative between World Bank and IMF that's responsible for delivering global recovery, post-COVID, and climate
No,
change.
no, no. I'm not. Excuse me. I'm not part of any high-level advisory board to anybody. I'm not part of the present government. I'm not a part of any IMF thing. I have been a member of a high-level group that was meant to advise on how to develop multilateral financing for climate change.
Mm.
That is a report that went to the Committee of Parties. It's not the IMF.
Okay, okay. So I stand corrected. I was under the impression that's a joint initiative by both the institute. Anyway, so the point I was making, that you would, while you represent an era when you were at the helm, that witnessed the highest growth. But now post-COVID things have changed, and our post-COVID recovery has been phenomenally great, and that world recognizes. And but there are nervous factors. There are red flags. There are two prominent things that there are two nervous factors. If we can call out one. One is the debt to GDP, public debt, and the other one is inflation. And both are uh, they have some nexus as well. So now in this context, as you speak, so the encasing committee that, if I remember, not to make it academic, so he was of the view, the committee was of the view that ideally we should have a 60% thing, but
Hmm.
whereas actually we have 83 to 84%. But we draw comfort from the fact that as a country that the country that we would like to benchmark ourselves with, whether Japan, South Korea, even US, even most of the EU countries, their debt to GDP is somewhere in the range of 150 to 200%. So we are much lower. Even China, no chapter on India is complete without referring to China. So China is almost same. Now there is no optimum. I've never been a formal student of economics, but just with a permission, uh, it is largely agreed that for a developed economy it is 60%, and for an emerging economy like us it is 40%. So now with a high public debt, the two obvious thing that happens that crowding out the social spend, the space for social spend get limited, and because of the larger interest outgo. But we are a country at the same time, we're a country and it is government agnostic. No matter which party rules, we have to balance between the fiscal discipline and the growth aspiration that we have. So where do you see that we are heading on that front? I mean, I don't need a very specific, concrete response on it because this is an ongoing phenomenon that we have been experiencing as a country. So your thoughts are because you
Well, I think the government is no longer, at least from what I read, the NK Singh committee had said that you should target the debt to GDP ratio. They had said that it should be 40% for the center and 20% for the states or something. So you get a total debt to GDP ratio of 60%. Okay. I think the government most recent statements say that we are not going to target the debt to GDP ratio, but we are going to make sure that it slowly comes down. So there's no target, but it won't rise.
gradualism.
Uh, for that, for that, the fiscal deficit has to be also brought under control, but not very sharply. Okay. The real question is, how big a fiscal deficit are you willing to tolerate? Okay. By the way, if you do manage to bring the debt to GDP ratio down, that will reassure people that no crisis is going to happen all of a sudden. Okay. And that is very important because in a developing country, if a signal goes that there could be a crisis, money can really flow out. I think what the government has stated that we will bring the fiscal deficit down so that the debt to GDP ratio comes down. This will help people to think that, look, the government is at least committed not to see an increase in the debt to GDP ratio. And that will mean that on the fiscal side, there has to be some discipline, maybe not enough discipline to bring the debt down. Um, I think that if you look at what we need uh, moving forward, there are many areas where if we want to achieve the objective of inclusive growth and Viksit Bharat and so on, we have to spend more money in various areas. Okay. Some of these are health, some of these are education, some of these are research on agricultural development. There's climate change. If climate change is taking place and we want to protect ourselves from climate change, we have to have our own crop research that will protect the productivity of our crops. Nobody else is going to do it for us. I mean, they're interested in their problems. We need to know what do we do to make our rice productivity better than it is, etc., and also our livestock productivity and so on. So that requires more expenditure. It's a world in which the security situation is highly uncertain. With the, I mean, all over, starting from the Middle East, going to the eastern end, we we almost certainly will need to spend more than we are doing on defense because a lot of our defense is just taken up with people with salaries and pensions. And quite frankly, a modern defense capability depends much less on people and much more on technology. But we have a very heavy burden. The PLA has completely revolutionized itself. They've cut down numbers and gone for technology. So while we think we're spending a lot of money on defense, the real question is what are we spending on equipment to modernize our defense forces? And what will we need to do in the next several years? Then on industry and AI and so on, there is a perception that these are very critical areas where the government will have to spend more. And then there's a lot of desire that we should provide the additional resources needed if you want to bring in investment. So we need a medium term plan. I mean, plan is a bad word these days, but we need a medium term plan to be able to say that how much expenditure are we going to need? And in order to accommodate this expenditure, how much revenue do we need? And is the present revenue structure capable of that? Obviously, if the growth is faster than 6.4%, we get more revenue. But in order to get to more than 6.4%, we need a lot of private investment. And in order to get private investment, we need to have a smaller fiscal deficit to release resources into the private sector. So the way I look at it is if you want to achieve your objectives over the longer range, you better do something that would take care of the fiscal imbalances that we face. So that's a very big challenge.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for such a meaty response. Just making a quick comparison to 91 to maybe 2014. I think the good thing is the exposure to external borrowing is declining. But debt is a debt. So therefore, I mean, without further extension on that, so we go that we leave that there. Then we get into our next issue. That's about the rupee-dollar equation, and that has sort of that has not only become a central theme of our economic discourse, even otherwise that is a bit scary. It has its own pitfalls in terms of how do we sort of manage our economy. So, in your view, so at this stage, it is the Central Bank of India, so it needs to intervene, or you subscribe to an idea of free float where the rupee finds its own level.
Well, look, nobody subscribes to the idea of a completely free float. Everybody subscribes to the idea of a managed exchange rate. The question really is that should the rupee have weakened to the extent to which it has? I think it should have. Because, by any standard, the real effective exchange rate of the rupee had been allowed to appreciate. I mean, when you stabilize the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar, which we were doing for a long time, and your own inflation is much higher than the dollar inflation, then effectively, in real terms, you're appreciating the rupee. And at a time when the balance of payments is weak, that doesn't make sense. So I think the exchange rate adjustment, which has recently been done in the last 2 months, is the correct thing. And the RBI has done a good job of that. I am also concerned that I've failed to see the point that constantly talking about the exchange rate. Right now, Trump is saying that the dollar is too high. I mean, he wants the dollar to be depreciated. He doesn't say that. He said the other countries should appreciate vis-a-vis the dollar. And this is what the US has consistently done in the past. I mean, whenever they wanted the exchange rate to be adjusted, they've called the other fellows and said, you appreciate your exchange rate because we are the kind of numeraire in the system. So I think, frankly, a developing country should not get hung up on the belief that a strong currency is good for the economy. It isn't. Uh, the rise of the East Asian countries and China took place because they kept their currency weak. In fact, China was constantly criticized during its most successful phase. China was constantly criticized by the US for being a currency manipulator. What does that mean? They're not allowing their currency to appreciate. So the fact of the matter is that, if we develop well and if all other systems are go, exports are rising, foreign exchange is coming in, FDI is rising, then the rupee might appreciate, reflecting economic strength. But when the economy is weak for whatever reason, okay, and money is going out and the rupee depreciates, to try to keep the rupee artificially high doesn't strengthen the economy, it weakens it even further. And unfortunately, it has never been easy to explain this, not just in India, but everywhere. But this is the most important thing that you journalists and other independent commentators should explain. Uh, at any given situation, there is the right exchange rate that you should be aiming at. What it is not very easy to judge. But if you believe your export performance has been poor, and it has been poor, and if you believe that foreign direct inflows in foreign direct investment have not been as good as you want, and if you believe that the global situation is one where capital may flow out towards the United States, then I don't think it makes sense to be targeting a strong exchange rate. That doesn't mean you let the exchange rate go. You have to be there. So I don't believe in the notion that free float and all that kind of thing. But you need a mature understanding of what is a reasonable basis. And let me put it this way: if we are forced to lower tariffs, which, as I said, we should, and the international situation also will put pressure on us to lower tariffs. I mean, the easiest way of protecting our domestic industry when you lower tariffs is to depreciate the exchange rate. That's what we did in 1991. And no industry minds a 5% cut in tariffs if the exchange rate depreciates by 5% because it offsets each other. So the import competing industry is left just as strong and the exporter is benefited. And that's what you need.
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. And before we move to the next, and my quick reaction to your response to the previous issue that we did, I think one of the core point that was part of the 91 policies, I mean, the debate was around the poor export performance then versus the import substitution, which is largely misunderstood in different timing. I think the takeaway is there is no absolute, this is being a very subjective topic. There is no absolute straightforward response to that, but one has to be cognizant of the fact that things can move in different ways. So one has to, there's no single best findings that will help us determining what is most ideal, because the ideal world doesn't exist in the to start. Now we land in a topic that is something was not very directly dealt with part of the reform that you drove as labor reforms. Uh, you just took the name of Dr. Rajan. Recently, he praised Modi for the physical infrastructure. We have our finance minister, she was reported to have made a statement in where that employability is a concern. And see, the idea is not to single out these people. So the issue that I'm referring to, so while it is important for us to build physical infrastructure, we also need to have, along with hard, we need to have soft infrastructure. And essentially, I'm referring to the human capital. So we have an NEP in place, the jury is still out, the new education policies. If in a market economy that will applies even in this sector, so the supply and demand, they are not, the interaction is not that great. So basically the job market that requires a particular demand, but there's full of credentialism. There are degrees which are commoditized. People buy and sell degrees. So in the way people might have degrees, but they're not employable. And it's a concern. It's a concern because we take credit in our demography, we take credit in our youth, young population, but at the same time, if you're not preparing them to take up the responsibility job, they're not skilled enough. Basically, the upskilling of the upskilling ecosystem. Where does India stand, and what do you think as a country we should do? Not in a very prescriptive manner, it can be a directional response, so that this can complement the physical infrastructure that we need to have, because this is a big red flag.
Well, there's no question in my mind that human capital has to be an extremely important priority looking forward 10, 15 years. And that really begins with foundational learning in our schools, because all the evidence we have suggests that while our education policy has succeeded in bringing kids into school, and it certainly created a desire on the part of parents that their children should get degrees in school, the quality of school education is not up to scratch. So, I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but the short answer is you need to improve both the motivation, the quality of teachers, and the governance system within the school, so that you're constantly measuring whether the results that you want are actually being obtained. And I think we've fallen behind on that, and that's probably true. We need to do better, but maybe our uh, whoever's responsible for this area needs to think hard about it. And let me say that one of the problems that we have in education was originally a state subject, but has become a concurrent subject. But most of the educational institutions are state institutions, both schools, as public schools, as well as state universities. So I think one of the things we should do is to allow the state governments to experiment. Some of them will make mistakes. The idea that we should centrally control all this in order to ensure quality, I don't find very credible, because it is in the interest of a state government to improve the quality of its own labor force. And if it doesn't, its labor force will not get jobs, and the state government will have to bear the responsibility before the electorate. So, how to get an educational system responding to the need for improvement is it's a governance come political issue, but it is largely an issue that requires state governments to respond. We don't have enough pressure on state governments to deliver. I mean, we have these debates at the national level, but we don't have the same pressure at state government levels, and we should.
Absolutely. And just an extension, just as a correlate to this, recently I came across a piece by Vikram Singh Mehta, CSCP. He was, as his reaction to the US action, the preemptive deportation to military aircrafts. Obviously, whether they were proletariat or not, obviously people who can afford 55 lakhs to enter US illegally through Mexico. Probably there is more to it. It's so, but the point he was trying to say, there is enough space for the source and the host country to work together. There's a silver lining that he was trying to draw from there. Because this migration, the cross migration is not something which one would can stop or would stop. That's not the idea. But at the same time, how we can work in coordination. And when I say the labor market in the factor market, you very rightly pointed out. In fact, the states in our constitutional scheme of things in the federal structure, the states have larger role play in context of moving reforms. Except finance that you belong to, the rest all in the factor markets, whether it is the land, labor, the materials, that all with the states. But for some
Yeah.
reason, as you know, we have been sort of tuned, we have been used to as ways of working where the states themselves have also drawn comfort from the fact that for everything, like union budget, everybody talks about a state budget is never analyzed or doesn't get the kind of attention that it otherwise deserves. And the planning commission that probably the only other person that had a similar stint like you is Mr. Gulzar Nanda, the first planning commission. Otherwise, you are somebody who have been at the helm for 10 years. You have supervised two 11th and 12th policies. The fulcrum of those two policies have been accelerated growth, sustainable growth, and I'm just missing, I'm just forgetting the 11th. 11th was about the acceleration. The 12th, it had two statements. So the why I'm bringing that with even Dr. Singh, I remember when he was in your position, because you held a position which was once held by not only economic giants, even the political stalwarts, right from Gulzar Nanda till Manmohan Singh. Even Narasimha Rao was the planning commission deputy chairman. You had S.B.
No,
Chauhan.
no, no. Narasimha was never deputy chairman.
He was not. So
No,
before,
no, no.
Manmohan Singh, who was, it is not Mr.
Oh,
Rao.
you had several deputy chairmen. You had K.C. Pant, not
KC
before
Pant just
Manmohan
before
Singh,
you.
but
KC Pant just before you.
certainly later. But there's several. Gadgil, you had
Yeah,
Gadgil,
DR
you had
Gadgil during 69, the
uh,
bank nationalization, the
yeah.
loan mela.
So quite a few people.
So absolutely. So the point I'm making that Manmohan Singh in one of his speech, while as the serving deputy chairman planning commission, I think if I remember correct, it was Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He made a point that a national PAN panel, the efficacy of a national PAN panel when we really want to empower the states. Obviously, the context could have been different. So you are making a very subtle remark, and you rightly pointing out that there is enough space, room for us to we have to travel beyond what is there provided under the constitution. The central government has a foremost uh, role in empowering the state so that they drive these reforms. That takes us to the next issue, that of financial inclusion. I mean, it might be a buzzword for economists and others analysts who follow this story.
No, it's not a buzzword. It's a very important thing. I mean, everybody who is credit worthy should be able to get credit. And I think over there, the digitalization, the build-up of Aadhaar, the build-up of the India stack has been a very major transformation.
True.
And I'm sure that it will lead to much greater financial inclusion, which is
Absolutely.
a good thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as we speak, I think there's a talk that Aadhaar, how it can be linked to the other identities. I think that's one of the most profound reform that would have ever happened in this country. And obviously, the credit goes to the leadership that time they all were there. So this income inequality that becomes a continuing concern. So the access to resource, for whatever reason, I don't think we need to set a context. So the point that bothers everybody, and I know you also had a you were known for having a very strong view against all this freebie culture. Uh, we is there a justification, or is it high time that we revise our welfare program? Because generally we have been government after government at some point in time, because the political class, just to make it straight, they have they have sort of found this as a convenient tool to reach out to their constituents. Now, what has happened in the end? So it is happening at the cost of enduring, lasting, structural welfare programs we all should
Yeah,
be
that's true.
having instead of that in the short term, these handouts. So where do you see that? I mean, there's no political party can take a moral ground that they're not guilty of it, that everybody does it, but it doesn't help neither not a particular party, not the country as a whole, as the economy. So where do you see that we are moving on this? So
Well, I mean, that's a tough question. Can you hear me?
yes, sir,
Okay.
perfectly.
No, I have no simple answer to offer because, quite honestly, I don't know. In the end, if you maintain fiscal discipline, then governments will not be able to have too many freebies without cutting certain things. So I think they will have to make up their mind. Either they do freebies and don't have fiscal discipline, in which case you'll have a crisis, or they want to give some freebies and they cut something. And then the political process will determine whether the cuts were worth it or not. Most people who want freebies believe that freebies are free and they don't cost anything.
Absolutely. Because I think the biggest damage that does is that reset the quality of reform that we do, the quality of expenditures.
Yep.
So this takes us to the next issue that is about the climate change. And here are we wanted to take it up with more in a specific context of agriculture. Now we all know that India has committed to a net zero emission by 2070, and we also know that before we start climbing down, we have to reach the peak in emission. So what that means is we have to galvanize, we have to expedite, accelerate our economic growth, and so growth with green agenda, it's not a simple thing to happen. There are a lot of declaration, a lot of framework, a lot of protocols. There are a lot of internal, external pressures that they're with us. Where do you see that our journey has been, and are we on the right track on that? Because
You know,
any government,
the journey is just begun.
yeah,
I mean, look, we are supposed to get to net zero by 2070. So technically, we have almost 45 years to get there. We have to do a lot. I think it's known what we have to do. I've written about it extensively. Probably in the short run, the most important thing we have to do is to do more renewable energy and get away from coal. That doesn't mean we immediately start reducing the coal stations because there's some in the pipeline. But I think we should have a target that, after a certain period, no more coal power. During that, up to then, we must greatly increase renewable energy. In order to do renewable energy, there are many other things that have to be done. And it will require action by both the center and the states, because in the end, electricity is a state subject, and the discoms are state run, and the discoms have to be financially viable, otherwise, they won't be able to do what is necessary. More generally, for climate change, let's be clear, India will be one of the worst affected countries. And the current estimate is that if we don't, and we can't control the climate, the world has to control the climate. So we must pressurize the world to control the climate. If we fail to do that, then all the evidence we have suggests that agricultural production will be 15% lower in 2050 than it is today. I mean, sorry, not than it is today, than it otherwise would be. So you have an agricultural trajectory, but if you fail to control the climate, then whatever that level was would be 15% lower. So that's almost like losing three-fourths of a percent per year in agricultural growth. And to handle that problem, we need more expenditure on agricultural research. We need a lot of water conservation. And that is really part of adaptation. We have to spend a lot of money to make sure that the water that falls gets absorbed in the ground and is not rushing off into the sea and is wasted. It's a huge agenda. But, unfortunately, it doesn't figure in the political discussions. Though I might say that this is beginning to happen. I mean, for example, I'm a member of the Tamil Nadu government has set up an advisory panel on climate change to advise the Tamil Nadu government what it should do to improve the climate situation. They have actually very wisely said that, look, we are a more developed state than the average of India. So India wants to be net zero by 2060, 2070. We should be net zero by 2060. Now, in order to translate that into an actual action plan, they're doing some work. So I think every state, I think the center and the states need to get together. The center needs to indicate what it is going to do. It has to indicate what the states must do. And a lot of that involves cooperation between the two. So I think we need effective consult. This would be an excellent example of cooperative federalism if it can work.
Absolutely. Great. And it's good to know that Tamil Nadu has a proper plan in place and not to
Well, they're working on a plan. They're working on a plan,
working on a
and
plan.
they keep reviewing it. I should also add, by the way, I think Maharashtra has something, Kerala has something. Other states are also working towards this. But the quality of these plans, the technical quality, needs to be critically reviewed. It's very easy to do a plan with just full of slogans. I mean, and that's also necessary because slogans are what drive people. But the slogans, they need to be critically assessed so that experts can advise that this is a wonderful slogan, but will you actually achieve it? And you must be willing to listen to that advice and take steps to correct whatever is wrong.
Fair enough. Absolutely. And then again, not to uh, to undermine the efforts by the state that you're referring to. So we just spoke about the public debt. Now the data suggests that the few states which are contributing almost more close to 40%, there are just 5 states. And obviously Tamil Nadu is a model state, even pre-GST era, because of the kind of infra investment it has committed itself to. But ironically, the among all states, that is topping seven, the debt share of Tamil Nadu is relatively high as compared to UP and Maharashtra, the other states, and
Yes.
followed by Bengal and Karnataka. Anyway, so financial leverage has its own beauty. So that is not
No,
something
but
that
I think the difference actually is that while Tamil Nadu has a high debt, the use of resources that they have made allows Tamil Nadu to have a faster growth rate. So, the debt to GDP ratio that you can sustain is a function of the growth rate of the economy.
True.
So I think the idea of a common debt to GDP ratio is just wrong. 20% doesn't make sense to say. And unfortunately, in the earlier thinking, that has been the approach. It's 20% for the states as a whole. But if we were to decide what it should be for individual states, I don't think it's correct to say it should be the same. I mean, a state that is growing rapidly can sustain a higher debt to GDP ratio because the higher growth will bring the ratio down automatically. A state that's not growing rapidly cannot sustain a higher debt to GDP ratio. Those calculations have not been made, to my knowledge. But I think in the debate as we move forward, this should be discussed and made more publicly known, and it should be part of the political discussion within the states. Look, in every state, this is an issue that the opposition to the government, whatever it is, should highlight. I mean, unless in a democracy, unless the opposition raises these issues, why would anyone bother with them?
Fair enough. Absolutely. I think we are in the fag end of the conversation. And before we get into the closing remark, just out of academic interest, it is not part of the framework that we agreed to. You refer to cooperative federalism and planning, the most powerful, mighty power planning commission, now we call Niti Aayog. So they drive the cooperative federalism, with the fiscal federalism lies with finance commission. And just out of curiosity, so
by the way, excuse me, let me interrupt you. The Finance Commission does not ensure fiscal federalism. The Finance Commission meets once in 5 years to decide what is the share of taxes that goes to each state? It does not address the issue of whether this is enough, what should you do. They're not a continuing body. They're not involved in consultations once they've given their report. So how can they do anything on fiscal federalism? Not at all.
Uh, Absolutely, I would agree with, but the understanding that I have, the when it comes to execute, I mean, conceiving, executing, and even adjusting the policies, it's all planning commission. But the transfer
No,
of
there is no planning commission now.
Niti Aayog.
So I don't think Niti Aayog gets into financial matters.
No, it
So
doesn't.
they're not involved in any of this as far as I
So
know.
that's precisely my question. So in the question of date, when I said, so this, the whole point is that I want to check with, I mean, clarify something with you. So for all the states, for all their borrowings, it is, they do all the borrowings under the sovereign borrowings. That is, the India government becomes the guarantor for them. For a state A to borrow. Okay,
No,
so
by the way, the government of India doesn't stand guarantee, but the government of India approves the foreign borrowing. The finance ministry does that. The
okay,
finance ministry decides how much borrowing each state can do.
yeah.
The problem is that the states have many ways of getting around that because they get their other bodies. They set up bodies which are state-owned bodies, which then borrow. And the banks kind of assume that it's the same thing as a state debt, but it isn't.
Okay.
So this is it will work itself out in due course.
Okay, okay. But you have answered even before I completed my question. So my doubt was around whether it's the finance commission or the planning commission, which one of the two
No, first of all,
help
let's be
the
clear.
state.
There is no such thing. There is no such thing as planning commission. That
Okay.
is you're talking about 11 years ago. Planning commission was abolished. So there is no planning commission. There
Yeah,
is a
we
Niti Aayog.
yeah.
That is a consultative forum. They, as far I don't know, but what I've been told is that they do not get into the financing issues at all. Okay. They can be a convening group. They can get people to meet, but they don't distribute money. All the money that is distributed is done by the finance ministry.
Very good, Bhatia.
So the decision making rests there. Of course, they must be consulting the prime minister all the time. So that's where the decision rests.
Absolutely. I think it's a perfect occasion to pay our tribute to the greats like K.C. Nyogi and the Mahalnavis, I think, who under whose advice and Pandit Nehru started that. Now we had a very extensive conversation, and obviously because of your experience as the head deputy chairman of planning commission, I think we had our own fair share of insights, and we all are finishing this with the fair share of enrichment on this subject. Now to summarize the 91 moment that you articulated with so much of passion, and we all were interested. I think the viewers, there's nothing can match hearing from you, one of the three architects that designed, they engineered the whole thing, and they delivered so successfully. And whether they strongly, out of the conviction, they felt that where amputation is required, a band-aid approach doesn't work. So a system that has started making noise for long, that needs overhauling, but that none of the stakeholders, they were willing to, I mean, they were in a denial mode. They pretended as if system is nice and fine, but I think here there's a team that two of them are unfortunately are not with us anymore. But we really appreciate you joining us and taking us through, because 91 can never be I mean, technically that might be a historical event, but that is not something which is going to fade away from anybody's mind. So no matter which decade one is born. So it is in that context, we also touched upon a few of the key areas that any person who is interested in India's story, it is not what about this government, that government. I think that was not the spirit of the conversation. And I think we all achieved the objective that we wanted to have from this conversation. We wanted to understand few of the key concerns that impacts India's economy and its nexus with the global setting. And that is what we wanted to deal with. And you have been an absolute delight in presenting your thoughts, sir. And with this, we
Thank you.
End this conversation. Thank you so much and really appreciate.
Thank you very much. Well, all the very best and thank you for the show. Bye-bye.
Thank you.